My name is Kurt Miner. I'm the Senior History Curator here at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I'm also the curator of this exhibit. It's titled Why Not in Pennsylvania? Campaigning for Women's Suffrage in the Keystone State, 1910 and 1920. For this exhibit, we focus in particular on our own collections here at the State Museum and the State Archives to tell the stories of women and events in Pennsylvania during that critical 10 years leading up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920. The story begins in the 19th century, but really begins to pick up speed in the early 1900s when women across Pennsylvania began campaigning in earnest for the vote. The effort to win equal rights for women actually has a very long history, including here in Pennsylvania. This particular section of the exhibit focuses on the 19th century prehistory to the Votes for Women movement. Pennsylvania women, although they were not involved in political parties, were very much involved in social movements of the 19th century, particularly abolition, the effort to end slavery, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the effort to bring about alcohol abstinence in Pennsylvania, and other movements like the City Beautiful movement and the effort to bring playgrounds to urban parks. Women organized into a wide variety of women's groups, including, for instance, the Women's Club of Oakland, which was in Pittsburgh in the early 1900s. Other groups included the Pennsylvania Federation of Women's Clubs. There are also a number of pioneers in the women's movement who are from Pennsylvania. Probably the most prominent of those was Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott was a Philadelphia Quaker who, in 1848, joined with Elizabeth Cady Stanton to organize the first women's rights convention. That's the Seneca Falls Convention. Myra Lloyd Dock was another important woman who was, although not an out-and-out suffragist, was nonetheless quite involved in social reforms. She led the City Beautiful movement here in Harrisburg. At the top of this exhibit panel, we feature a reproduction of probably the most famous or iconic image of the women's suffrage movement in the 1910s. It was first published in Puck magazine in 1915, and it shows an allegorical figure, Lady Liberty, with a cape that says Votes for Women, striding across the West as if to liberate in the East all the women east of the Mississippi who don't have the vote but yearn for it. And that's really sort of the beginning of this momentum to bring the vote to women by moving state by state. Pennsylvania gets on that bandwagon to the extent that this really breathes new life into what was a relatively static women's movement. And the idea is that women can organize for this if they're willing to take the movement from the parlor, as they would have said back then, out into the streets. This is a photograph showing the scale of the meeting that was held by the Women's Suffrage Association of Pennsylvania in 1914. Really gives you a sense of the variety of women, especially in terms of ages now involved in the movement. The other thing we focus on is how women became very savvy politically, and they knew that if they were going to get the vote, they would need to begin lobbying state legislatures. Important move in 1912, the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association moves its headquarters from Philadelphia to Harrisburg in order to be able to focus on key members of the state legislature. They would need their support to push through a statewide referendum, which they were eventually able to do in 1915. One of the more important figures in the national movement in the 1910s was Alice Paul. And although Alice Paul was from New Jersey, she really used Philadelphia and southeastern Pennsylvania to get the suffrage movement started and test out some of her ideas. Alice Paul was the original member of the National Women's Party. It's something she started in 1916. She was also the most prominent woman to advocate for a more militant approach to achieving suffrage by using more direct tactics. She famously said women should not ask for the vote, they should demand it. And it's interesting that she used Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular as a place to try out some of those new tactics that she then eventually took to the national stage. One of my favorite artifacts from this campaign to spread the word is this very rare handbill that was clearly distributed in Pittsburgh, and it amounts to a celebrity endorsement for women's suffrage. And as you can see here, it mentions that Pittsburgh Pirates general manager Fred Clark is from Kansas, and Kansas has given women the vote, so we should follow the lead of Fred Clark and give Pennsylvania women the vote. Of course, in order to make this suffrage amendment go forward, women had to convince men, who were the only ones, of course, at that time, who had the franchise. And this was one effective way to do so, by appealing to their interest in baseball. The campaign to win women the votes at the state level in Pennsylvania reached a crescendo in 1915. And that is the year that Pennsylvanians finally had the opportunity to vote yea or nay on women voting through a statewide referendum. The run-up to the referendum saw a lot of activity in Pennsylvania, especially on behalf of the women who were trying to reach the electorate who would be voting in November. One of the more interesting aspects of that campaign was something called the Justice Bell Tour. In early 1915, a group of suffragists got together and came up with a plan to have a kind of publicity stunt that would involve a group of women driving across the state with the goal of reaching all 67 counties. And they would drive around the state in a truck that had a Liberty Bell replica outfitted to the back platform. They used that Justice Bell Tour as a way to speak out on behalf of suffrage, to distribute pro-suffrage materials such as this Votes for Women hand fan, Votes for Women pins and buttons, and to some degree it was a fairly successful campaign on behalf of an amendment which, although it failed, came very close to passing in November 1915. There was also a very strong anti-suffrage movement in Pennsylvania, as there was across the nation. And the sources of the anti-suffrage forces were various. Opposition emanated from the liquor interests in urban areas like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and also from just simply socially conservative sections of the state, including here in south central Pennsylvania, where outside of Harrisburg. The anti-suffrage movement, like the pro-suffrage movement, relied on propaganda. They disseminated a lot of information in opposition to suffrage, including this wonderful collection of anti-suffrage postcards. The anti-suffrage movement played into fears that if women had the vote, they would end up relegating men to subservient roles, like housekeeping and child rearing, for instance. There was also a concern that the women's movement was being infected with socialist thinking, and that they were, if women got the vote, they would advance the cause of socialism and prohibition and other things that the general population appeared to be opposed to. So in 1915, Pennsylvania defeats the statewide referendum. That really begins to shift the movement away from trying to win the vote through a constitutional amendment at the state level to gaining the vote through a constitutional amendment at the federal level. Beginning in 1917, the National Women's Party begins organizing parades and marches and protests, ultimately focusing their efforts on Washington, D.C. Pennsylvania, probably largely because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., plays a disproportionate role in those marches and in those pickets. I'm looking here at a photograph of the Pennsylvania delegation that was sent to Washington, D.C. in 1917 as they were preparing to picket the White House. It was the picketing of the White House in those early months of 1917 that really begins to change the tide of public opinion on women's suffrage. Women organized, it's important to note, the first peaceful protest at the White House. It was through the suffrage movement. By summer and early fall of 1917, peaceful protests were being met by resistance from local police, and famously in November of 1917, a number of pickets were arrested and imprisoned. Among those pickets were a number of prominent women from Pennsylvania, including women like Dora Lewis, who was a very politically well-connected society woman from Pennsylvania, who nonetheless was a strong ally of Alice Paul and was fully believed in her more direct confrontational tactics. She is arrested in November 1970, sent to prison, and proceeds to go on a hunger strike, along with, again, another group of Pennsylvania suffragists who had also been arrested. As part of one of the more interesting components of this exhibit is a notebook that we have from a woman, her name was Elizabeth McShane, who was among those arrested, imprisoned, and kept, interestingly enough, a prison diary while in the Occoquan workhouse that described her treatment there, which ultimately led to her hunger strike and then a forced feeding. The forced feeding of these women in the hunger strike in late 1917 seemed to be the tipping point. After this, public opinion again turned in favor of suffrage. Woodrow Wilson himself, who was tepid toward the movement, endorses it. That leads ultimately to the introduction of the 19th Amendment in Congress, which passes in June of 1919 and goes out to the states for ratification. I think it's interesting to note that when the 19th Amendment goes out to the states for ratification, Pennsylvania becomes the seventh state to ratify relatively early on. It's interesting because to think that 4 years earlier it had defeated a statewide referendum. So clearly the movement had shifted. The 19th Amendment becomes a law of the land. The replica Liberty Bell, which had been silenced to symbolize the fact that women's voices were silenced, was rung in a very important ceremony in September of 1920. And then most importantly, after the official ratification of the 19th Amendment, in November of 1920, women in Pennsylvania, including in Pittsburgh, as shown in this photograph, were able to cast ballots in elections for the very first time. This exhibit showcases the important role which Pennsylvania played in the struggle to win women the rights to vote, which was ultimately culminated in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Our exhibit, Why Not in Pennsylvania? Campaigning for Women's Suffrage in the Keystone State, is open until the end of this year.